state your full name and your date of birth, please?
Mark Irwin Fleisher, 1943.
And which war did you serve in?
Vietnam.
And what were the dates for your service?
Total dates or Vietnam?
Total dates.
April 14th, 1965 through September 12th, 68.
Okay. Now, when
You went into the military. What caused you to go into the military in the first place?
Well, I had finished college. I was working as a researcher for a law firm in New York City where I grew up, and received my draft notice from the Army, and decided I really didn't want to go in the Army, so I enlisted in the Air Force. And that was, again, in April 1965.
Where did you go to college?
Ohio University, Athens, Ohio.
And what did you study there?
Journalism.
Journalism, okay.
But I realized, I got out of school, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I was thinking about going to graduate school, and not thinking about going to graduate school, and knew that, if I did not go to school, I would be subject to the draft. And I guess I decided to take my chances, because I really wasn't sure if I wanted to go to graduate school at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, as I say, took my chances with the draft, and I had a low number, and I got called.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel when you got drafted?
It wasn't a surprise. As I say, I was drafted by the Army and decided. Well, I think probably I said, well, if I go ahead with the draft, get drafted, go in the Army, I have a pretty good chance of going to Vietnam, which at that time I had no desire to do. So I said, well, I'll go enlist in the Air Force, even though it was 4 years as opposed to 2 years, and said, my chances probably are less. Well, it turned out I went to Vietnam anyway. So that basically was how I felt about being drafted. I mean, I didn't have any qualms about going in the military per se.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how your family felt about it?
I think my mother was probably more concerned, certainly more concerned than I was. I just saw it as another, I was, 22 years old. Got the world, you get the world on a string. Nothing can hurt you, nothing can harm you. And so I just said, well, whatever transpires, whether I go in the Army or the Air Force or whatever, it's just another chapter in life. And she of course was concerned. My father was concerned, but it wasn't a major panic or anything.
What did you know about Vietnam at that point?
Not much. Other than at that time in 65, it was a pretty low-level kind of operation. It didn't seem to be making major headlines at the time. There certainly wasn't anywhere near the opposition that later developed. I think, as I recall back, I think most people, at least people I knew, thought that it was going to be one of these, we'd been there in one degree or another for a couple, 3 years with advisors and eventually troops, but it was going to be, in and out relatively quickly. I don't think anybody thought, at least no one that I knew thought that it was going to develop into what it developed. And I had friends. I had a really good friend who was going to law school, who eventually went to Vietnam. He was a captain, and he was an Army lawyer. And I had a couple, more than that, 3 or 4 guys I went to college with that I was close that eventually went. And nobody, as I say, nobody thought it would have developed and transpired into what it did. Mm-hmm. At that point, anyway.
Did you ever consider enlisting?
Well, I did in the Air Force.
Okay.
I mean, that was
okay.
Volunteer, but my encouragement was the draft.
Was the draft in the Army? Okay.
Right. And as I say, even though the Air Force was 4 years, as opposed to the 2-year draft, I don't know. I felt, I guess in the back of my mind, that I wouldn't be, my chances of being exposed to combat were probably less, or at least I thought so, by going into the Air Force than being drafted into the Army.
After you enlisted, what happened next?
Okay, I enlisted in, well, I had all the paperwork done in probably, I think, in March of 1965. They said, go home, and I think, that was late March, and they said, April, whatever it was, report. I remember I reported to, it was a kind of a military processing center in Lower Manhattan. I can tell you where it was, Whitehall Street, and reported there, and then we got on buses and we went to Newark Airport. I mean, this is after I had said all my goodbyes and everything. We went to Newark Airport and we flew to, let me see, Atlanta, stopped in Atlanta, then Houston, Texas. Then we got on another plane and went to San Antonio, Texas. Got off in San Antonio, and that's where Air Force basic training was and still is, Lackland Air Force Base. So that was the middle of April of '65. Basic training was 6 weeks. You got that finished up roughly, June 1st. And then the school that I was to go to, it was very fortunate because the school was located on a little island off of New Rochelle, New York, which was about an hour from my home. But the school, and it was an all-service school. I mean, it wasn't just Air Force, but it was operated by the Army. But the next class didn't start until probably at some point in late July. So I stayed in Texas for roughly a month until the school started, and then went to the school, which was probably about 6 or 8 weeks, about 8 weeks.
What do you remember about Lackland?
Hot. God, it was hot. I remember it would get, if the temperature got to a certain point and the humidity got to a certain point, they ran up a red flag and they said, stay indoors, no outdoor activity. It was very hot. It was a huge place. I mean, I look at maps of, like San Antonio today, just on a Rand McNally atlas, and I always thought Lackland was in, I'm not even sure what part of the city it was, north or south, but I always thought, for example, it was in the north and turned out to be in the south, or it might be the other way around, I don't remember, but big sprawling place, like any basic training, they put you through the ringer. And
what was a typical day like? Well, first, you remember your first day there.
Yeah. Well, a typical day was basically you got up at, I don't know, 5 or 5:30 in the morning or something like that. You marched everywhere. You marched to breakfast. Went through breakfast, and then you had, well, they had classes and drills and rifle practice and more classes and more drills. It was very repetitive. But I mean, the idea of basic training, any basic training probably, is to, instill a certain amount of discipline, a certain amount of unity with the people you're serving with. The drill sergeant, we had 2 or 3 assigned to our barracks. The head guy I thought he was a terrific guy. The other 2 were, quite frankly, a couple of real jerks.
Do you remember their names?
The head guy was Sergeant Rourke.
Okay.
The 2 jerks, one was Hispanic, and I don't remember. He wasn't too bad. The other guy was Earl Deyo, D-E-Y-O, and I'll remember that name as long as I live, because you'd be out all day and you'd be sweating like a dog, and you'd come back into barracks and he'd look at you and he'd say, he had 2 phrases, because obviously he knew your background because he had your personnel forms. The one phrase was boy, you're going to get set back. He was a Southerner. And set back meaning you're not doing too well, you're going to have to go back to square one, start all over again. And the second one, which was pointed at me and maybe 3 or 4 other guys, you a college boy? That sort of thing. And of course you'd have to say yes, sir, and make some derogatory remark, you know. But
When would he make these comments to you? Were you doing something in
well,
particular?
you were basically coming back to the barracks after being out all day, and it was you had maybe, you know, a little bit of free time to kind of wind down before you marched off to dinner. And you know, you really didn't want to hear it. You just wanted to go lie down in your bunk for a half hour or whatever. And but I'll never forget that. I guess it was you know, sort of standard operating procedure, meant to scare the hell out of you, you know, which it did, because you certainly didn't want to start over again. You know? But it was interesting because after I got out of basic and had to stay there the additional 4 or 6 weeks, because by that time I had a stripe on my arm, so you're a big deal already. And the Sergeant Rourke, the head guy there, he came up to me one day, and because you're on what's called casual status, you know, you're in between things, and so they had me picking up cigarette butts around, and he came up to me one day. He said, "You went to college, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You can type, can't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "There's a job. They need a clerk in the base education office." He says, "I want you to go down there and tell them I sent you." And it was air conditioned, and it was beautiful, you know. And he was just a nice guy. It turned out to be. I mean, he did his job. He was rough on you, but he was basically a nice guy.
Did you stay in touch with any of these people?
No.
Now, did you, at the time you enlisted, did you enlist with anyone that you knew from back home
No.
at the same time?
No.
Okay. And so you didn't know anybody once you got down there?
No, it was interesting because our particular thing, it was called a squadron that was in the barracks. There were a bunch of people from New England, New Hampshire, primarily, and a bunch of people from Hawaii. And I don't know whether whether they, you know, grouped them together or they all enlisted together or what, I don't know, but that was pretty much the makeup. So I would say probably 75% were New Englanders and Hawaiians, were from Hawaii. And the Hawaiians were interesting because they were Caucasian, Chinese, obviously, you know, mixed. So that it was kind of an interesting mix overall, and everybody got along. I remember that. No, there were never any arguments or fights or whatever.
That is interesting that some of the stories that we've heard about basic training during the Vietnam era, everyone always mentions racial tension. Did you?
Not in basic training.
Not in basic training.
In fact, it was funny. I was in a top bunk, and the fellow on the bottom bunk was a Hawaiian of Chinese descent. And you know how it is. You know, you got to make that bed tight. You know, when you tuck it in, you bounce a quarter off of it.
Right.
And he could do that. He was just unbelievable. So he did my bunk and his bed, and I did something else. You know, and we all got along very well. I never remember, and I know it's not blocked out or anything, but there was never any tension whatsoever. And we had black guys in there as well. Probably I think from New York or Philadelphia or something like that, and everybody, and there weren't cliques either. That was interesting. Everybody kind of stuck together. So.
What was the general attitude about the war, or didn't people talk about
I
it?
don't think they really talked about it. I think you were more interested, quite frankly, in, you know, they're sending me off to this school. Gee, I wonder what that's like. That sort of thing.
At that point, did you know you would end up in Vietnam?
Oh no.
Okay, no one did.
No idea. No idea. That wasn't until I was stationed in Massachusetts, which was after the school I went to.
Okay. What things were you learning in basic training? What were some of the tasks that they were actually putting you through?
Oh, drill, how to, what's called manual of arms. You know, you have a rifle and, you know, it's order arms, present arms, that sort of thing. Rifle practice, physical education stuff, the obstacle course, and then classroom stuff like military things. You know, you figure, you know, what do I need this for? But it's all part of it. Military courtesy and uniform code of military justice, Geneva Convention. I mean, you'd have maybe a couple of hours or whatever on that sort of thing. Then you'd have sort of stuff on well, I guess you could call it propaganda in the sense of, here's what the military can do for you. You want to make it a career, and, educational benefits and this, that, and the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily, though, I would say it was drill and physical fitness stuff and rifle practice.
Mm-hmm. What time did your day typically end?
Well, in a way, it never did, but I'd say probably about 7 p.m. But there was a rotating schedule where you would be, what's the term? CQ, charge of quarters, where you'd be up. I'm not sure if it was through the night or just maybe like 4-hour shifts, but you'd be assigned to guard the front door of the barracks. I mean, who's coming? I mean, I don't know who's coming in or whatever. But so that was a rotating thing that you grab that, a couple times a week. But other than that, they pretty much left you alone in the evening. I mean, lights out were, I don't know, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, whatever. But between the end of, say, dinner and lights out, they pretty much left you alone.
Mm-hmm.
But pretty much didn't bother with you.
Did you ever leave the base?
Legally? No.
Legally?
I'm trying to think because it did, but I can't remember if it was after. No, I guess if it was after I finished basic and I was there for the 6 weeks hanging around. I think it was before. I think like your last weekend of basic, if memory serves me right, you could go into town. You had a pass. You could go into town just for the day. And you had to be back by a certain hour, that sort of thing. And we did. And they had a bus that went in, and we did that.
Do you remember what you did when you went in?
We went to Breckenridge Park, which was a big city park in San Antonio with a zoo. And I don't know, 3 or 4 of us just wanted to be sort of out in the air, And then we went downtown. I was a little older than most of the guys. I was, as I say, I was 22 at the time. Most of them were, 18, 19. I could drink legally. Well, I guess they could too in Texas. And we probably went to a bar and had a few beers and walked around. And I remember, God, this is really weird. It was one of the main streets of San Antonio, downtown business. Oh, we went to the Alamo too, of course. One of the downtown business streets, and they had these torrential rains like 2 or 3 days prior to the day we were there, and all of these like beetles had washed up out of the sewer system, and the stores, there were a lot of stores that were closed because these beetles were just, you couldn't get into the store without walking on and over these things. And I can't remember if they were dead or alive, but you'd walk on them and they go crunch, 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 and it wasn't very appetizing to say the least. But and I guess after I finished basic, and again, as I say, was hanging around there for 6 weeks or so, I'm sure I went to town several other times, but I don't remember anything, particularly noteworthy about it.
What did you do in the interim after basic and before you went to school?
As I say, I worked in the education office, and there were a lot of things on base. I mean, they had movies and libraries and stuff like that, and of course you weren't paid a heck of a lot of money, so you really didn't have a lot of spending money. So basically, I guess stayed on base, and there were 2 or 3 of us in the same situation, waiting for the same school to start. So we kind of hung around and went to the gym on base and movies and library and stuff like that.
To backtrack a bit,
Yeah.
when you went into San Antonio, what was the dress code?
As I recall, you had to wear your military uniforms.
Okay. And did the public respond to that at all?
The only response I remember were as you got off the bus. And I can't remember if it was like an Air Force bus or like a municipal bus. I can't remember. There'd be a horde of Mexican American kids wanting to shine your shoes or sell you cigarettes or ad infinitum. That's the only. I mean, people in town. I mean, San Antonio was and is a big military town. And I think there's been some base closures now, but then there were I think 3 Air Force bases and 1 or 2 Army installations. So it's one of those towns that's grown up with the military, and there was never any hostility or anything like that. I mean, they welcomed what few dollars you had to to spend, but I don't recall any hostility whatsoever.
What school did you want to go to after basic?
What I wanted to go to and what I wound up going to, it's called the Defense Information School, and it was at Fort Slocum, New York. It since has moved. In fact, I think we were the last class. It's now out in Indiana, and what it is, it's a all-services school, basically to teach you military journalism. And the instructors were all military from all services. And in fact, one of them is, I'm not sure, he may have retired by now, turned out and became a professor of journalism at Syracuse. And it was really, it was excellent, I thought. And I think it was about six or 8 weeks. And then after that, you went to your first, real assignment.
What kind of classes did you take at the,
Everything.
in the school?
Writing, editing. It was basically very similar to what the journalism courses I took in college, only with a military slant to it.
Mm-hmm. What was the military slant?
Well, getting familiar with military terms of all of the different services, because one of the ideas was that, you're in the Air Force, but you may be in a situation where you're dealing with people from the one or more of the other services, and it turned out to be very true. It was sort of, getting the military message across. And the instructors, as I say, were very good. They were all very professional, and we enjoyed it. Fort Slocum was an interesting place. It was, I believe, was actually built during or shortly after the Civil War, and it had this huge parade grounds, I remember, and very historic place, which I guess since has been torn down. And you had to take a ferry, the Army, this is funny, the Army ran a boat, a little ferry boat that took you to New Rochelle, and then you could take a bus to the train, take a train to Grand Central Station, and you'd be in the middle of Manhattan in 45 minutes or whatever.
Did you go in often?
Oh yeah, and I lived in Brooklyn, so I'd go to Grand Central, get on the subway, and I'd be home in another half hour.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was good because you were basically free on weekends for the most part. So from say Friday night, Friday evening, and you had to be back by say 5 o'clock Sunday evening or something like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's pretty much most weekends I was home.
Mm-hmm. How'd your family feel about that?
That they loved, naturally. And there was another fellow who was from Queens, and he did the same thing. But most of the guys were not from the New York area, but they'd go into Manhattan and have that opportunity at least, which was good.
Mm-hmm. What was your first assignment?
First assignment was at Otis Air Force Base, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. I thought, hey, this is all right. And I reported there in the middle of September of '65. I'm trying to remember, because when you were in school, as far as the Air Force guys were concerned, you could ask for a specific place. Doesn't mean you get it. And I honestly don't remember asking for any. I'm sure I did, but I just don't remember. I don't think I asked for Otis. I can't remember. I know the guy who was from Queens, he asked for Suffolk County Air Base on the tip of Long Island, and they sent him to North Dakota. So maybe you're better off not asking for anything. I don't think I asked. I said, wherever you send me, you send me. So I reported there, as I say, in mid-September of '65.
And what was your assignment?
I was assigned to the base information office to work on the base, primarily on the base newspaper, which was called the Otis Notice. And it was printed under contract by civilians, but those of us in the office did all the writing and the editing and layout and what have you. But the actual printing was done by civilian, under contract.
What was a typical day?
Typical day, you got up, if you wanted to have breakfast. I mean, it was totally different than basic training, because basically, other than the hours you were at your work, it's pretty much you're on your own. So you get up, have breakfast if you wanted to, work your day, go home. Your nights were essentially free.
Mm-hmm.
It was, in a way, almost no different than a job anywhere, except you wore a uniform. And every once in a while, it's time we got to clean the barracks. But the nice thing about it was, primarily, for the most part, I mean, we got moved around a little bit, but for the most part, it was like living in a college dorm. You had double. For the most part, it was you had a double room. If you looked at the building from the outside, it was a brick building. It looked like a college dorm. Really.
Were you alone in a room? Did you have to share?
For the most part, I was in a double, and then they moved us around, and I got a single room after that, and an older wooden type, more traditional two-story barracks type thing. But both of them were, they were pleasant.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a typical day, what tasks might they have asked you to do?
In the work situation?
In the work situation.
Well, the newspaper came out weekly.
Okay.
So, as you finished one, you were always, doing stuff for the next issue, and you'd interview different units we had aviation units, so you'd interview, for example, the guys who did certain kind of maintenance, and that would be like a features thing. And we worked, we had photographers that we had access to, and it was typical kind of news. You covered or most of all, I guess they would bring in the news, the wives' clubs and the various clubs and organizations on the base and stuff like that. So it was pretty much constant. And then you do, you do news releases to the media on noteworthy kinds of events or medal presentations or stuff like that. Did a lot of what they call hometown news releases. Guy gets a medal or something, so you say, what's your hometown paper, and you fill out a form and they send it to the Hometown News Release Center. Where was that? Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma. You'd send them the raw information, and then they type it up and send it to the guy's hometown paper, and that and presumably they print it in the hometown section, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any stories they covered at that point?
Oh boy.
Anything jump out at you?
Well, the things that jump out were rather unfortunate. I got there in September of '65. A few months prior, they had lost an aircraft, and their main mission was, at that time, what they called airborne early control and warning. I should have brought the picture, but if you've ever seen, you could maybe have seen them on the History Channel, because there was a civilian airliner counterpart to what they flew. These triple tails, they call them Constellations. Eastern Airlines used to fly them all the time. And they'd fly up and down the coast, looking for any, this is the Cold War, or the Russians flying across the Atlantic. And they had this big hump on the top of the aircraft where all the radar stuff was. And the theory was something happened and the thing flipped. Well, anyway, they had lost an aircraft about 3 months prior to me getting there, and in the 22 months I was there, they lost 2 more. And unfortunately, I'd say, in the 2 crashes when I was there, I think they lost about 25 or 30 guys. I think there was 1 or 2 survivors out of the whole thing. You know, a couple of them were people I knew. I'm not saying they were close friends, but you know, you knew them. And we didn't, you know, you didn't cover it per se, but you had to be available because, you know, you were needed for certain things. And, but I mean, other than that, everything else was, you know, it was nothing. You know, it was kind of routine. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had interesting characters on the base, you know, who had an interesting job, and you know, maybe do a story on that, but you know, nothing earth-shattering. Put it that way.
Now, whether you did a story on them or not, do you remember some of these interesting characters?
Well, I remember we had a guy, unfortunately, I don't know why I come back to this, but he was killed in a crash. And his name was Captain Utz, U-T-Z. And we call it, and he was a fighter pilot. And he wore 6 guns. And we called him Wyatt Utz. Okay? And he was a good guy. And he was involved with a lot of kids groups and stuff like that. And he was just an interesting character. And I remember, I think I did a story and just, you know, here he is, Mr. Macho fighter pilot, but when he's off duty, he's, you know, coaching little league teams and taking kids. There was a fishery, state fishery type thing just off base, and he would take kids out there, you know, stuff like that. And he was just a, you know, and I don't know if you've ever noticed the potato chip Utz. Mm-hmm. And every time I see one of those trucks, I think of him, you know. Mm-hmm. And we had a good office. We had good people in the office. Everybody got along, and we had a good time. Actually, had a good time.
Now, were they all men at this point?
We had one woman when I got there. She was essentially like the secretary, answered the phones. She eventually got transferred somewhere else. Another woman came in who was a little bit higher ranking, and she was more of sort of an office manager type. She wasn't a journalist. She was more an administrative thing. But I mean, she, you know, more of an office manager. Because we had, I'm trying to think, for the most part, 1, 2, we'd have 2, sometimes depending on time I was there, 2 or 3 officers, and generally probably 4 to 6. I mean, fluctuated 4 to 6 enlisted types.
How often did you interact with the civilians that published the paper?
Well, that was on a weekly basis,
okay.
And they were good. They were, you know, typical sort of Cape Codders, and it was interesting because I think we put the paper together on Wednesday. And they printed on Thursday, but Tuesday night we'd be in the office on base doing all the last minute stuff. We'd drive it out to their place on Wednesday, and we put the whole thing together, and then we'd go out on their boat. You know, we'd finish up about 1 or 2 in the afternoon and go out on their boat, you know, if the weather was nice and stuff. And we had a good relationship with them.
Mm-hmm. To put the paper together, who was in charge of assigning stories? Who was the editor, or who was in charge?
One of the people primarily the base information officer, who was head of our office. I mean, he basically oversaw the operation, but we had the senior enlisted person basically was the assignment editor, so to speak. When I say put the paper together at the printers, I mean physically. You know, it's not like today when it's all computers. You physically, and it was offset. It wasn't type. You know, it wasn't lead type, but it was all coming out of a very rudimentary computer, so to speak, in those days. So it would actually be, here's the page. Okay, so a story would come out of the computer, and you would have to typeset it, but not in hot type. Okay, so they would do that, and it would come out of the computer, and you just paste it down wherever it was going to go on the page. And sometimes, you know, maybe you didn't measure it correctly, so you'd have to cut it a little bit, and then, you know, it was more of a sort of a cut and paste type operation is what it was called, actually. But you know, they did that the physical work of doing that with us there. I mean, because if you had to make some alterations or changes, you know, we had to say, yeah, okay, go ahead, we can do that.
Do you remember the size of the paper?
It was tabloid size.
Okay.
Yeah. And the arrangement was I think the contractual arrangement was the Air Force paid them not a heck of a lot of money to do it, but they had the ability to sell advertisements, and they would keep the revenue from the advertisements.
Were there a lot of ads in?
Yeah, quite a bit. Because, I mean, you had a pretty good-sized surrounding area, you know, Cape Cod, and these guys, the 2 or 3 guys that ran the printing place, they were hustlers, and they, you know, had lived there all their lives and knew everybody, so they did a good job. I think they had and we weren't their only client, naturally. I mean, they had a, you know, commercial printing operation going as well. So I think they did pretty well.
What was the circulation of that paper?
Oh boy, I couldn't tell you.
Not just the base, it went.
No, it went. It was available outside as well. Yeah, I would say probably easily 6,000 to 8,000, probably something along those lines.
When that assignment started to wind down, where did you think you would go next?
Well, it didn't want. I mean, there was no set time period that said you're going to be there. I mean, you were there until the Air Force said you're going somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I had been there, as I said, from mid-September '65 and through the rest of '65 and all through '67. And I said, God, I need a change. Cape Cod's great, but in the summertime, but the winters were not so hot. Mm-hmm. So by this time, I would say it was probably early '67, and I said, so I volunteered for. Well, I would have had a little over 2 years left in my enlistment, and probably in the back of my mind, I said, I'm not making a career of this. So I had, say, roughly about 26 months to go. And most of the assignments in Europe were 24 months. No, it would have to be less. I guess it was a little bit later in '67, so I was under the 2 year. I mean, it was probably 22 months to go. And most of the assignments in Europe were 24 months or more. Thailand was 18 months. And I said, well, Thailand doesn't sound like a bad place. So I volunteered for Thailand, not knowing that at that time, at least, when you volunteered for a specific country, it made you eligible for the world. And I'll never forget, it was my birthday, May 5th of 1967. I was down in Falmouth, Massachusetts, in a bar we all used to frequent called the Harbor Lounge. And a guy who worked in the personnel office was in there, who I knew, and he said, hey, your orders came in. And I said, oh, Thailand. He said, no, close, though. So that was my unofficial notification. Mm-hmm. And so I left Massachusetts in July of '67, had, I guess, the end of July, and had I took a long leave, about 35 days or so. Well, I guess, yeah, and then I had, you get so many days of travel time, and mm-hmm. So I was home. And
what was your rank at this point?
I was in Airman First Class.
Okay.
And I went home, and I had a lot of, obviously because I went to college in Ohio, I had a lot of friends in Ohio, so I decided to make the grand farewell tour, and I had a 1963 Chevy at the time, first car I ever owned, and so I drove out to Cleveland. I had friends in Cleveland, and I had some friends in Columbus, and another friend who was still at Ohio University going to grad school, so I sort of made a grand tour, then came home, and I decided, well, I had to go to San Francisco to leave for Vietnam, And I'd never been to San Francisco before, so I figured, well, I'm going to go out there, 4 or 5 days early, and I did that. And then reported to where I was supposed to report.
How did you go to San Francisco?
Flew.
You flew, okay.
Yeah, from New York. And my aunt had worked in the travel agency business, and she was a world traveler anyway. But she was, she said, here's a list of hotels that are not expensive, but they're okay and they're good areas, and go see this and go see that. So as I say, I probably spent about 4 or 5 days in San Francisco before I went overseas.
What things did you do there?
Oh, I'm trying to think specifically. Just the whole tourist. I remember I did take the Gray Line tour of the city. I think I went out to Alcatraz and Fisherman's Wharf, and I've since been back, and it's changed quite a bit from those days, but it's cleaned up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That was an era when San Francisco had some, what they called the Tenderloin District, which was sort of sleazy bars and stuff like that. I was not a sleazy bar person, so I didn't frequent any of that stuff. But it was the type of thing you walk through and say, yeah, I saw it, that sort of thing. But yeah, and museums, and I remember they had some good jazz clubs, and that's pretty much what I did with it.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel about going to Vietnam at this point?
This is, I surprise people when I say this sometimes, but I was eager to go, in the sense of, by that time it was September '67, and a lot had transpired in Vietnam, and there was a lot of, certainly more controversy. And I felt, I wanted to see for myself what it was all about.
Mm-hmm. So this was the reporter's instinct.
Yeah, and I like history and that sort of thing. And you probably, I never thought of it that way, but that's probably very true. And I wanted to see for myself what it was all about, knowing that, I would only see or only get a very limited perspective, but at least I would know more than I knew at the time,
Mm-hmm.
before I went, excuse me.
Where did you embark from in San Francisco?
This is sort of funny because you had specific orders to report for a specific flight
Mm-hmm.
out of San Francisco Airport. So you report 2 hours early or whatever, and then they tell you to, being in the military, they tell you to go sit and wait somewhere, so you go sit and wait. And I remember they came up and they said, well, you'll have to wait for another flight because this flight, they overbooked it, the military overbooked it. And what they were charter, they contracted with charter airlines, so you weren't flying, American or anything. You're flying something, some of them were World Airways and Saturn Airways, things that don't exist anymore. But so I think I was supposed to leave in around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and I think we wound up leaving 7 o'clock the next morning. But they told you don't leave the terminal because they might change and you might get on it. So, all right, so typical, you're in an airport for 8 or 9 hours. Wonderful. No different than it is today. So we left from San Francisco. We went via Anchorage, Alaska, stopped there, and couldn't get off the plane. I guess it was just a refueling thing. And then we flew across to Japan. And I think they let us off the plane, obviously stay in the terminal for maybe an hour and a half, and then got back on and then flew to Saigon.
Do you remember the atmosphere for the trip?
It started out, very noisy and talkative and that sort of thing, and the closer we got, the quieter it got, because, again, everybody, had some apprehension, and, it's sort of the great unknown.
Do you remember talking to anybody?
Yeah, the guy I sat next to, I can't remember his name or where he's from, but he was going to be a security policeman at the same base that I was assigned to. And during the year I was there, I ran into him a couple, 3 times, and I think I got a hold of him, just to leap ahead a little bit, before I left, just for the heck of it, to see, maybe we were on the same flight, but he was leaving like a day different than I was, or something like that.
No, was everybody on the plane Air Force?
Good question. I think so. I think they were. Yeah, pretty sure they were. Yeah, definitely, because the Army people left from Oakland, across the bay, and a lot of those guys, believe it or not, even in those days, went by ship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You were talking about the conversations you'd had with this person on the
Yeah.
flight.
It was just, where are you from? What did you do before you went in the service? And what are you going to do when you get there? How do you feel about things? And, and everybody, I think everybody, or at least he was, and the people around us, I don't want to use the word scared, but I mean, it's sort of a fear of the unknown. And I think we all had it. You just don't know. I mean, you read a lot about it and you heard a lot about it, but how much was fact, how much was fiction, and I think it was more of just a fear of the unknown, or being apprehensive. You didn't have any choice. You were flying in the middle an airplane across the Pacific, so I mean, by that time the die was cast, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And where did you land?
Landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, just outside of Saigon, which is where I was stationed.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have to go anywhere. I mean, a lot of guys would go. I mean, there were three major, for the Air Force at least, arrival spots. So if you were stationed at one of those 3, you just stayed there. But there were obviously other places you could be stationed within the country. So then then whatever arrangements were to get you to those places were made. But I didn't have to move on.
What happened after you landed?
Well, I remember getting off the plane, and it felt like a blast furnace. I mean, it was probably, temperature and the humidity were probably in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just hit you like a blast furnace. And you got off.
What month was this?
This was mid-September.
Okay.
Right around the 12th or 13th. You got your gear. I don't remember how this worked. I think they took you to a central, they took you to a central sort of processing area where housing was assigned to you. They told you where you were, and then they basically told you, well, go report to where you're going to be working. And they gave you directions, and they had little Air Force buses running around the base. And so if you asked the right questions, and you could figure out where you needed to be. And actually, I think someone from the place where I was working they knew I was coming, and I think someone showed up at the processing center and said, "Okay, you're with me, and I'll get you squared away, and we'll go from there."
So you sort of went in a private vehicle rather than transport, or?
Could have been. Yeah, I don't remember. It could have been a Jeep rather than a bus.
Mm-hmm. So you went right to work?
Well, at least reported in, and they said, well, go get settled and show up tomorrow, that sort of thing.
Do you remember your first impression when you walked in?
Yeah, it was the 7th, the command was headquarters 7th Air Force, which covered everything in the entire country. We were, as part of the 7th Air Force was called the Directorate of Information. And then our unit was part of the Directorate, and we were called Combat News. And I had no idea how many people were in our division. And it turned out, let's see, 2, 3, probably close to 20 people. So I said, I thought we'd be like 3 or 4 or something like that. And I'd say we had probably between 15 and 20 most of the time. And it was a pleasant enough, nice enough office. I mean, austere, but I mean everybody had a desk and no computers in those days, but you had typewriters
And who was in charge there?
We had of our specific division there were 2 majors, and the one major was senior.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember their names?
Yeah, his name was Lou Cantalou, who just died a few years ago. And the other major was Ed Johnson. And then they shared a separate office at the end of the building. Mm-hmm. And then we had I'd say probably about 15 other guys.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember a lot of them vividly, or?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. After you kind of checked in there, then where did you go?
Well, they basically, after you got back to work, they basically told you what you would be doing. Mm-hmm. And basically, what my particular job was, a large part of it was to be going around the country, interviewing, doing stories, interviewing, for example, Army people who had been involved in an operation, involved in combat, where they were aided by the Air Force. In other words, the message was, I don't want to say make the Air Force look good, but tell the Air Force story. That was the motto. That was the official motto. Tell the Air Force story. Yeah, the guy on the ground, the Army guy on the ground carrying the rifle. Yeah, he's doing his job, but we're enabling him and his unit to accomplish their mission a little bit better because of our support. So we do that sort of thing, a lot of that sort of thing. In the first several months. We did other things. I remember, God, they had one airplane that was a cargo plane, and it was reserved to take VIPs around the country, visiting congressmen, stuff like that. The thing, you know how combat aircraft are painted camouflage. Well, this thing was aluminum. You could see it coming a million miles away. Mm-hmm. How it never got shot down was beyond me. And I remember going on a couple of things with that, just with visiting congressmen and that sort of thing. Again, they'd go visit. I remember one specifically. It was up in the Central Highlands. It was after a battle, major battle, at a place called Dak To. That would have been in November of '67, and they went up there after the battle to be briefed by the Army commanders, and myself and another fellow from our office were up there to make sure that these guys, knew the Air Force story, that the role that the Air Force played in this major battle. And then we would do stories on Air Force. We called them sort of routine stuff, but units would adopt an orphanage, for example, and we'd go do a story on that. And a lot of that was for hometown news consumption, or Army doctors or Air Force doctors treating Vietnamese civilians, on a major scale. We did stories on that, and a lot of our stuff. Not all, but a lot of our stuff got distributed to major U.S. newspapers and the wire services and stuff like that. And we would get back I think once a week or once every couple of weeks. The Air Force, I guess, ran its own clipping service, you know, and you'd see stuff that you did incorporated in a larger story under Joe Blow's byline in the Chicago whatever, you know. Mm-hmm. And we had access to 3 or 4 photographers that were assigned to us. And we'd send out teams out in the field and stuff like that. And mostly it was covering Air Force operations that assisted troops on the ground. That was a major part of what we did. I have to sort of divide my time into two, because after Tet, which was January 31 of '68, the big, major blow up, our role sort of changed. We had a turnover in who was running the Directorate, and they decided that they didn't want us going out in the field as much as we were going.
How often were you going out in the field prior to that?
I would say we probably spent 50% of our time out in the field. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and I would say from mid-September to, that was the end of January '68. Mid-September to probably somewhere in March or April, I have very, very vivid recollections of the things I did. But after that, from say April to the time I went home the following September, we didn't do all that much. They kind of put us under wraps for one reason or another. I have no idea why. It was never explained to us. But we spent most of the time in the office, except 1 month I did go to another base because they were shorthanded, so they sent me there. And I was able to do a few of the things that I had been doing. But
and it was never explained.
It was never really explained. I don't know whether because we had some casualties out of our office. Maybe they wanted to limit that. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I have no idea. Or just maybe it was just a change in philosophy, and it filtered down to us, but it was never really explained. And another thing that we did, going back to the stuff we did, we interacted with some of the civilian correspondents who were there, who may have needed some assistance in doing things or information in doing things, stuff like that.
Do you remember a specific incident?
Of
when you actually were working with some of the civilian correspondents?
Yeah.
So are these like NBC, ABC, CBS reporters?
Yeah. One was a woman named Liz Trotta,
okay,
who has written at least a couple of books that I know. Trotta. She was NBC. She was terrific. I mean, I remember one night, again, you had this rotating kind of thing where you were the night guy, so to speak, and she came in covered in mud and everything. And I don't know. I mean, I think I got her a flight, arranged a flight to somewhere else for her or something like that. And when I was when I mentioned that they had sent me to this other base for a month, Da Nang, I remember, what was his name? Don Webster. He was with CBS. And he came into the office one day and he said, "I'm Don Webster from CBS, and I need a helicopter right now." And I looked at him and said, "I don't care if you're, Jesus Christ or whatever. We don't have any," or something like that. Those are the two I remember specifically. But I mean, guys would float in and out. And the other thing that was interesting along those same lines, when I went home, in fact, they did this with everybody who was leaving. Of course, in those days they had no satellites, to beam the news from there to here. And they would say, "Hey, you're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." "And how would you like to do us a favor?" "Well, yeah, what?" And they'd give you a big film canister in a little orange mesh bag that in my case, it said NBC News on it. He gave me $50, and he said, there'll be a motorcycle rider dressed in black with a big NBC shield at the airport when you arrive. Just give it to him. I said, fine. So that's how a lot of that film got home.
Had you heard that that was going on
Yeah,
before
yeah.
they asked you to do it?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Other guys had said that they were leaving in a day or two, and they had this deal with whatever network it was.
And all the networks did this?
I think they did. I know, obviously, NBC did it because I was the NBC courier. And
what stories were they working on in particular? For instance, the two that you remember.
Liz Trotta, she was just sort of out in the field with Army units, and I don't know what specifically she was working on. And Webster was sort of a blowhard, and I don't know. He just I don't know. I don't know what he was working on, but he just had to have a helicopter at the precise moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the Air Force didn't have that many helicopters per se. The Army had the helicopters, but I guess he didn't know that.
When you were assigned to go out in the field, how was it done? Did you go out in a team?
Yeah, usually you went out with a photographer and what they called a radio tape guy, and he would do tape recorded interviews. And what they would do a lot of times with those is they edit them and do little bits for your hometown radio station. So for the most part, it was three-man teams. Occasionally I was a reporter. Occasionally it'd be two reporters, so it'd be a four-person team, 3 or 4 for the most part. There was some. I'm trying to think. There was one where I think it was just myself and a radio tape man, and they stuck a camera in my hand and said, "You take pictures as well." I said, "Okay." And but primarily 3, 4.
And how much risk did this entail for you to do this?
On a scale of 1 to 10, sometimes 1, sometimes 10.
Okay.
There were more than a few harrowing moments, but there were others that were, a walk in the park, so to speak. But you never knew, you never knew.
Can you tell me about a harrowing moment that happened?
Well, it wasn't harrowing.
We were talking about.
Right. Pretty sure this was November of '68 or '67. There's a place called Song Bay, S-O-N-G, new word B-E, over near the Cambodian border, and there was a kind of a airstrip carved out, and the Army had some installations there. And what the situation was, the Air Force had airlifted a huge number of Army reservists and I think National Guardsmen from the States to Vietnam. And then they got them into Song Bay at various stages, and then got them on airplanes and sort of dispersed them to their final destinations. And the 2 things I remember mostly was number one, the place was nothing but red dust. And of course you got all the airplanes are going literally 12 hours nonstop, landing, taking off, and kicking up all this red dust, which everybody was covered in. And at the end of the runway, well, I was saying a mile from the end of the runway, was a fairly good-sized hill, maybe the size of Harris Hill here. And the American troops occupied the hill during the day, and then they came down, and the Viet Cong occupied the hill at night. Mm-hmm. And we slept in tents, naturally, and they would mortar the area from the hill at night. I think we were there probably about a week. and it was like you knew it was coming, so you slept with one eye open. You slept with your boots on, so you could get out and get in the bunkers, so you wouldn't be exposed to all the nasty shrapnel and other stuff that was going on. So I mean, it wasn't a single harrowing event, but it was just you knew it was coming, and it was just not the nicest situation. I would say that the harrowing stuff really happened obviously around Tet and the weeks afterwards, when we were not out in the field, when we were at Tonson Hood, and exposed to all of what was going on then.
Geographically, how close were you to the battle zones?
At Tonson Hood?
Right. Did you have a lot of travel time to get in to cover your stories?
Oh, well, yeah, several hours.
How did you usually go in? A jeep?
No, we would fly into the nearest base.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of made your own arrangements. I mean, you went out to sometimes the arrangements were made for you, other times they said, well, make your own arrangements. And you'd go out to the flight line and you'd go up to the air operations desk, say you got anything going to such and such place. Yeah, you got any room? And I mean, it would be cargo planes. And they say, you got any room? Well, go check with the loadmaster, who would be the senior enlisted guy in charge of the aircraft, so to speak. And generally, they'd say, yeah, jump aboard. So your name was never on a passenger manifest or anything or a crew manifest. So, God forbid if the thing was shot down, they, who's that? That sort of thing. And then from there, you had primarily a jeep or truck to get into where you were going.
And you had a driver, someone drove you?
Both, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess it was both. And then there were humorous things too. When we were coming back from Song Bay, we had to make our own way, and there were two of us for that one, and we went from Song Bay to a place called Dalat, D-A-L-A-T, which is up in the highlands, and it was, in its day apparently it was the winter or the summer home of the Emperor of Vietnam. It was much cooler up there, and this huge vegetable growing area. And we were, again, as I say, we were covered with this red dust, and we went up to this crew of this cargo plane and said, hey, you guys going to Tonson Hood? Can we bum a ride? And they said, yeah, sure, no problem. So we were waiting for them to get all set and everything, and one of the guys comes out and says, Jesus, guys, I'm sorry, can't take you. I said, well, what's the story? He said, well, they had pallets of lettuce for general officers, no doubt. So one of my great war stories is being bumped by a pallet of lettuce, and we had to stick around there for a few more hours, and we got another flight. But it was just, one of those things that sticks in your mind. I mean, war is, obviously scary, but there are a lot of humorous moments as well.
How did you get your assignments?
I guess basically they came from on high. The colonel who was in charge of the whole directorate, he would tell our two majors, here's what I want done. The major would tell the master sergeant, who was in charge of basically the day-to-day operations, and he would say, and it wasn't like, okay, you're going to so-and-so tomorrow. It was like, hey, how would you like to go to, I mean, if you said no, they'd say, well, you're going anyway, but it was like saying, there's a really interesting thing going on up on a so-and-so, and we need to cover that. You want to go up with Joe tomorrow? And, that sort of thing. And you jumped at it. We all jumped at it. I mean, we loved it. Mm-hmm. We loved it. And it was really the younger. Oh, let's see. It was about myself, Dave. I'd say there was probably about 4 of us writers, three or 4 of us, who got the assignments. I mean, the more senior guys didn't go out. I mean, they had. Let me take that back. When I got there in September, there were 3 or 4 guys who outranked me who had already been there since the previous March. When they first got there, they did what I did when I got there. And after 6 or 7 months, as myself and other guys came in, we sort of, they were still in the office, but we replaced them as far as going out in the field, so to speak. And so they were doing other things. There would be times, for example, when we couldn't get back in time, so you'd get on find a telephone or something somewhere, and you, just like a newspaper rewrite desk, you say, well, here's what happened, and they'd be sitting there typing the stuff out. And there was stuff that you could do, and that we did when we didn't go out, that you would do from the office. Certain things that you could cover without going out, so to speak.
Prior to I mean, obviously it changed, but well, first of all, how was this paper different from the one you worked in?
This wasn't. This one we didn't put out a paper.
Okay, so you just issued these stories.
We issued these stories, right?
Circulated.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, it went from us higher up in our food chain, then it went downtown to the U.S. the joint, what was called JUSPAL, Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office. And they would have a briefing every day for civilian correspondents at 5 o'clock, which later became known as the 5 o'clock follies. And all this stuff from our office, from the Army, from the Marines, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it would be, here's the stuff we're putting out today, guys. And where it went from there, who knows? I mean, some of our stuff did go to like Stars and Stripes and stuff like that, more military oriented. But once it left our office, we had no idea what its fate would be.
Who were some of the people that you worked with when you went out to cover your stories?
The guys from our office.
Did you have someone you worked with, like
It wasn't a set team all the time. I mean, it shifted. One guy was named Dave Lardy. He was a reporter as well. The radio tape guy that I worked with for the most part was a fellow named Steve Sprague. Photographers, I have this thing about names I can remember. Emil Sapiri. Brad, I can't remember his last name. Or Bradley was his last name. Everybody called him Brad. Can't remember his first name. Rich, maybe. Sam was from Queens. Can't remember his last name. I can picture him, but I can't remember his last name. Those were primarily the guys that I worked with, for the most part. Sometimes you went out, depending on the kind of story it was, sometimes you went out by yourself. But for the most part, it was a team operation.
What was the rate of turnover in your office? How often do people go out?
Well,
and new people come in?
Well, you were there for a year,
okay.
Assuming nothing happened to you and you didn't need to go back earlier. So I came in September. Dave Lardy, I think, came in maybe a month or 2 after I did. You had somebody leaving, almost, at least a couple of people leaving almost every month, and new people coming in. But the guys that I remember most vividly were the guys that were there for the first say 6 or 7 months that I was there, plus the guys, as I mentioned before, the more senior guys who were there when I got there. I remember them very vividly. They kind of took you under their wing. They were all career. The 3 guys that I remember specifically they were all career. They had been in the service for one had been in the service for almost 20 years. The other guys probably 10, 12 years. So in a way, they sort of took you under their wing and showed you the ropes, and we had some good times.
Do you remember what you did in your off hours?
Off hours, yeah. We spent a lot of time in Saigon. Well,
how far away was Saigon?
A couple of miles.
Okay.
I mean, we were on the outskirts. Um, they had, well, the one guy in our office, the guy who ran the office, the top enlisted guy, he was a Master Sergeant, Bob Need. And he was a very cosmopolitan, urbane kind of guy. He had been stationed in Paris. He liked good food, good wine, etc., etc. And he was one of the guys who'd been there for 5 or 6 months when I got there. And he knew where all the good restaurants were, and there were a lot of good restaurants, not just serving Asian food, but French food as well. And he knew where you could get a real good steak and all that sort of thing. And a bunch of us would do that, and other things, you'd go into Saigon and just sort of sightsee, and they had some nice, believe it or not, some nice shops, and this is all before Ted, of course. You'd buy things to ship home, and that sort of thing, just sort of wander around. They had a beautiful, beautiful Roman Catholic cathedral, Notre Dame Cathedral, and a lot of temples, Buddhist temples, and they had museums and parks. And
Mm-hmm. Did it feel like an Asian city?
Oh yeah, yeah, very much, very much so. So that was a lot of what we did, I guess we worked 6 days a week, and then there was like a skeleton crew that rotated on Sundays. So for the most part, you had at least, I think we worked like half a day on Saturday during when things were normal. So you had maybe like a day and a half to yourself, sort of thing. And again, on base, they had movies and stuff like that. If you didn't want to go into Saigon, you could do the movies and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember ever eating anything or doing anything for the very first time in Saigon? Particular dish or?
Well, they had these sidewalk vendors that sold these what were alleged to be meat sandwiches. And I never had one because the word was they might have been monkey, they might have been cat, they might have been dog. So I never tried that.
Steer clear of the street vendors.
Yeah. And you also had to be careful because you were dealing with a population, you didn't know, are they friendly or not sometimes. And there were always stories about how if you bought a bottle of beer or a bottle of soda or whatever, that there would be ground glass in it. You probably heard that from other people. Okay. And so you always were sort of careful. But I can't remember. I grew up in New York, so I was exposed to a lot of different food anyway. But I can't remember. I ate a lot of good food, but I can't remember eating anything that was really off the wall, trying off the wall.
Do you remember what you were being paid at this point?
No, I don't. I know you got extra money for. You got overseas pay. I think was an additional $30 a month, and combat pay I think was somewhere about $60 or $70 a month. I think your basic pay, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred a month. So I would say maybe $300 a month total.
Do you remember if that was enough? Was that sufficient for what you needed?
Yeah, actually it was. And actually they had a deal. General Motors had a deal there where you could, they had an arrangement, I think it was with Chase Manhattan Bank, where you could put so much money in an account every payday. And like, for example, if you wanted to buy a car when you got home, you could put the money in, and then when you got home, you could put that money towards a GM car. And I don't know, they didn't match it or anything, but it was a nice arrangement. Things like that. Yeah, I always seemed to have enough money. I don't think I ever ran short. Well, I don't think you ever ran short per se. You might have to borrow a few bucks here and there, but every once in a while. But for the most part, it was okay.
Did you correspond with your family?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And was it easy to get mail back and forth?
Yeah. It took a while, obviously, and I still have not nightmares, but I still have dreams that I forgot my mailbox combination.
Oh, yeah, it was
You know,
one of the lock
yeah, it's
combinations.
one of those
mhm.
deals, yeah, not a key. And,
In the main, in like a main post office
right,
base? Okay.
right, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Do you remember ever asking your family to send you anything?
I don't think anything specific. I mean, my mom every once in a while would, send maybe cookies or something like that, or you would do, you know. I don't remember anything specific.
Do you remember what things were appreciated when they sent you packages or whatever? Do you remember what you really enjoyed getting?
Just food from home, or just pictures, or what everybody's doing, and that sort of thing. I don't think they really sent a lot. I mean, they would ask me, "Do you need anything?" And I say, "Well, I really don't."
Mhm.
I mean, basically you had your clothes. I mean, you didn't. Yeah, I mean, you had civilian clothes to wear. If you wanted when you went off base, but obviously you didn't need suits and ties and all that sort of thing. Just casual stuff. So I don't think I didn't really need that much.
Mhm.
Whatever you needed was available on base for the most part.
Do you remember the food on base?
Yeah, it was, typical military food, nothing, certainly, it was average, I guess.
Okay.
But there were places on the base where you could go. There was, for example, a restaurant run, well, it was called the Vietnamese Air Force Officers Club.
Mhm.
But anybody could go in, and regardless of your rank or who you were or what, anybody can go in. They had incredible Chinese food at incredibly low prices, and a lot of us would go over there, maybe a couple times a week or something like that. And again, like I say, when you went into Saigon, there were good places to eat. And there were, on base, there were, a couple, 3 places that had, a little bit better food than what the military was serving. And it wasn't bad, really. I mean, there was a lot of it, I remember, the military food. But, sometimes you don't want to eat in the mess hall with 500 other guys, that sort of thing.
Of the stories you cover, what's the most memorable one today for you in Vietnam?
Well, the Song Bay one that I talked about before, and probably 2 others. One of them was in a place called Canto, Cantho, which is down in the pretty good-sized city in the Mekong Delta. And the story there was there were, I think, 2, maybe 3 Air Force doctors who had set up kind of a makeshift hospital in an old building, and they were treating Vietnamese civilians who, unfortunately, were caught in artillery shellings or whatever. And the Air Force, or our people, decided, this would make a great story. And so myself and a photographer went down there and spent 3, 4, 5 days with those guys, and they were doing some unbelievable stuff. And I remember one specifically, it was a Vietnamese woman, she was probably in her 50s or 60s, and they literally, I mean, and this is under, not pristine medical atmosphere, conditions. And they basically reconstructed the side of her face and she'd been, I think it was shrapnel that pretty much shredded the side of her face. And it was just totally unbelievable, the kind of stuff they were doing. And the photographer I went with, there was that fellow Sam, that I can't remember his last name. And I've still got the pictures at home, or some of the pictures. He took some unbelievable pictures in the operating room. And the story, we went back to Saigon, did the story, or to Johnson, did the story, and it got sent out, and a major part of it was included in a larger story that showed up in Newsweek with one of the pictures of a small picture of the two doctors. It was I mean, it was a little different story. I mean, it wasn't direct combat. The other story I remember, interestingly enough, was it would have been right before Christmas of '67. Major Johnson, the guy, I think by that time the other major had gone home. Maybe not. But anyway, he said to me, he said, pack a bag for a couple, 3 days. I said, where are we going? He said, just pack a bag. I said, jungle fatigues? No, wear your summer dress. Okay. So I figured, well, I'm not going in the jungle. So we got on an airplane, and we're heading west. And we're up about a half hour, and he says, well, we're going to such and such a base, Karat, in Thailand. Oh, okay, what's going on? Well, President Johnson's going to be there. I said, oh, really? And what it was is Johnson had come to a base in Vietnam to hand out medals and meet and greet the troops, and then he was flying onto this base in Thailand to do the same thing. And there were 3 of us, myself and radio tape guy and Major Johnson. And we got there, and the schedule was that the president was going to arrive on Air Force One at something like 2 o'clock in the morning. And so our orders were, well, go do what you want to do and just be available 2 o'clock in the morning. I said, okay. Well, the radio tape guy, how should I put this in a nice way? He decided to visit some of the local female entrepreneurs in town. So he did. And he said, Steve, you need to be back here. No, I'm sorry. Let me backtrack. It was supposed to, the president was supposed to arrive at 5 a.m. I said, Steve, you need to be here, no later than 4. Okay. So the night moves on, and I figured, well, if I'm going to need to be up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I need some rest, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, at about midnight, the major comes back, and he says, the schedule's changed. The president's arriving at 2, not 5. And he goes, where's Steve? Well, Steve never made it back. So the major and I go down to the area where Air Force One is coming in, and we were arranged in kind of a U-shaped, and then he came down from the plane and he started working the crowd. And since Steve, our radio tape guy, was nowhere to be seen, so I've got the pad and the pencil, I've got the tape recorder and the camera around my neck doing 3 jobs. And the major is off schmoozing with somebody. And so I'm trying to take pictures, trying to write down, describing the scene, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, President Johnson's in front of me, and he sticks out this enormous hand. Just enormous. He sticks out this hand, and I grab it, and he starts to pump my hand, and he looks at me, and he says, where y'all from, Sergeant? And I said, New York, sir. He says, New York. He says, mighty fine state. I'm from Texas, I said, yeah, I've heard that, sir. And then he moved on. And then later in the morning, he had breakfast with the base in Thailand was primarily fighter pilots, and he had breakfast with them and handed out some medals. And then we did interviews with the pilots and did the hometown news release type thing. Meanwhile, to get back to our friend Steve, who finally shows up, and the major looks at him and says, consider yourself under arrest. And when we got back to Tonsanut, they busted him a grade and fined him a month's pay or something like that. To this day, well, I haven't seen him in several years, and I won't mention his last name. He's from the Southern Tier, and he used to work here in Elmira, and he would deny that this ever happened, that I was making all of this up, And I said, no, it's the truth. It's the truth. Because it's funny, because I reconnected with Major Johnson about 2 years ago through a mutual acquaintance, and he remembered the incident vividly as I just related it to you. So that was, there was two things that stuck in my mind. Neither one of them, really exposing me to combat, obviously, but that's the kinds of things that we did as well.
Mm-hmm. Of everything you learned when you were in Vietnam, is there anything that you don't think the history books are going to reflect?
Well, I know this is sort of a common complaint, but the treatment of Tet was by the American media was totally skewed. And I'm not just saying that from the standpoint of body count, because 200,000 of the bad guys got killed, and therefore it should be a victory. But in fact, I just read someone's account. Well, not account, but someone's view, which sort of coincides with mine, and said, it really turned out to be, it really was, and if you put it in an historical context, it was a major enemy offensive that was essentially beaten back. Was that any different than the Battle of the Bulge in World War II? A major enemy offensive that was eventually beaten back. Or the Battle of whatever in World War I forgot what battle it was. And when you put it in that kind of context, that's what it was. But I think, I know, but because of the controversy surrounding the war itself and all of the problems that were going on in this country over the war, that it became this, oh my God, this horrible thing, we're getting killed over there, we're losing, and look at this major offensive. Well, was it any different than the Battle of the Bulge? And all, the fact that, well, the American embassy has been occupied. It wasn't. That is a fallacy. They got on the grounds. The American embassy was not occupied. The famous picture of the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese police official executing the supposed guy in civilian clothes, who was a Viet Cong spy. You won't read in most accounts that Viet Cong guy in civilian clothes and others had shot and I believe killed most of the members of this guy's family earlier. And Eddie Adams, who took the picture, Pulitzer Prize-winning picture, has said, "I wish that was one picture I never took," because the story behind the picture is rarely told. And that to me is probably my biggest concern, if you will, about what's in the history books. I mean, I'm not by no means whitewashing the war, and I've just finished a book that tells very vividly, or points up very vividly some of the stupidity of the war, and so I'm obviously open to other ideas, but I think as far as the history books and looking at it in a very broad way, I think that's one major fault with the way a lot of people have reported the war and have, both from a journalistic and historical standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Would you have done anything differently?
In what way?
Personally.
Personally?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Okay.
To quote Dickens, for me, it was the best of times and the worst of times. And I'm glad I went.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously very pleased that I came back in one piece, but I'm glad I went.
So you were there for 12 months exactly, or?
Just about to the day.
To the day.
Maybe a day short, but just about. You know.
Were you counting down?
Oh yeah, everybody does. Everybody does. When you get there, when you hit double digits, for example. Well, I won't say double digits. I won't say in the 90s, but when you get down into the 30s and 40s, you know, days to go, you're what's called a short timer, and.
At this point, were you kind of staying back at the desk? You weren't going out.
Yeah,
anymore?
yeah. We did a few. You know, we did a few things, but nothing really major. Mm-hmm. And as you approached your date to come home, subconsciously or otherwise, you try to limit your risks if you could. For example, okay, you could take a week's R&R. I'm sure you're familiar with that, right? Okay. So I did mine in May, went to Hong Kong, fine. But you could also take at your own, and the government paid for that, you could also take a 10-day leave at your own expense. And this fellow, Dave Lardy, and I, who probably got there, he probably had a month and a half more to go than I did. And we got the idea, you know, we ought to go. You know, I mean, it's 10 days, you're not here, you know, you're in a safer atmosphere. So we went to Singapore, which was an interesting trip in its own right. But, so you try to sort of limit your risk a little bit, or, you know, at least subconsciously. But before Tet, I mean, we were, I'm not saying we were cowboys, but nothing fazed us, you know, about, oh my God, you want me to go up there? You know, we're shooting at each other. We didn't care. And it wasn't like we were heavily armed ourselves. In fact.
But you were armed?
Yeah. For the most part. But nothing major. We carried 38 revolvers, and I'd have to be about this close to you to do any damage, and then we'd have, you know, M16 rifles. But,
and you never were in a position of having to use them?
No, never did. Thought about it a couple of times, but I never did. But you know, things that also that were in the back of your mind, well, not in the back of your mind, but they should have been as you were flying around the country, you know, in this pre-Tet stuff where, you know, God, I'll go anywhere. You did a heck of a lot of flying. And, of course, aircraft get shot down, they have mechanical malfunctions, but, yeah, didn't worry about it. And then it was like a week after Tet, somebody decided that these guys are flying around the country, and again, you know, you have accidents. Maybe they need to go to jungle survival school. Okay, and that was in the Philippines. So myself and another guy, they sent us to the Philippines for a week, and I said, well, this is great because I'm out of the country, you know, and it's nasty there. So we went to jungle survival school.
What was that like?
That was interesting. It was primarily what that was for pilots and navigators and air crew people coming from the States to Vietnam. They'd stop off there for a week for jungle survival school. And it was at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and you had some classroom work. I remember they gave you a deck of cards that had pictures of plants on them, and this plant would be edible, and that plant was not, and so on and so forth. And then they took you out in the bush for a little bit, and they showed you a thing called, what they called 3-second Molly, which was a snake, and if it got you, you had 3 seconds to find an antidote. And then we had they took us in trucks to the base of a pretty good sized hill, and then we trudged up the hill to a camp area, and you had it was probably a dozen of us with a couple of instructors, and the what do you call them? Moro tribesmen, who were, and the tribesmen would teach you how to make in essence, a camp stove out of hollowed out bamboo, and we set traps and caught wild chickens and cooked them. You used your poncho to make a hammock.
This was the original Survivor.
Yeah, exactly. And then they had the escape and evasion exercise, where you went out on your own, and they would tell you, okay, you don't know the country, so when it gets dark, find your spot to hide, but after dark, stay there, because we don't want you, tumbling down a ravine or something like that. And then they would set the Moro tribesmen out to try and find you. And you had two or three little discs, and if the Moro tribesman found you, you gave him one of the discs, and then he turned that in for a 100-pound bag of rice or whatever. So you're on your own. So I'm out there, and I find what I think is a really good spot, and I'm there, and it's, you're wide awake, and it's dark, time is dragging. I said, boy, I need a cigarette. And I was lying on my stomach. I pulled out a cigarette, and I lit it like that, and next thing I knew, that son of a gun was literally walking up my back. But he was the only one that found me, just the one guy.
And it was the flame that...
Yeah, and I'm trying to hide the flame and everything, but he caught a glimpse of it. And then in the morning, you were, as part of the rescue operation, so to speak, the practice rescue, you had a big orange, like a parachute cloth, and you laid that on the ground. The helicopter came up, and like you've seen it in the movies, you get in the sling, and the helicopter hauls you up, and that was the school. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we came back on the plane from the Philippines back to Tanzania, we were the only two guys on the plane who had come from Vietnam. The other guys were all coming over. And I remember we were about to land, and they said, well, this is your captain speaking, and the temperature is 97 degrees, the humidity is 96%, and ground fire is light to moderate. And the plane just broke up. I thought they'd kill me, but no, the plane just broke up. So anyway, that was Jungle Survival School. That was February of 68. And then about a week or so after that came probably the most memorable moment of my year. Again, this was the time, in a few weeks after Tet, and even though the Tet invasion was essentially over, there were obviously still elements of the enemy within 10, 15 miles. And on most nights, there'd be a few rockets sent over, and the kind of weaponry they were using, 122 millimeter rockets, are extremely inaccurate. But it's a scary, when they're firing them and you don't know where they're going to land. Like they hit the base chapel, major military target. Right? And I'm trying to think of the exact day. I think it was the 14th or 15th of February. It was during the week. We were in the office. It was around, it was right after noon, maybe 12:30, because some of the guys had gone out to lunch. And my desk was at the far end of the room, and there was a desk opposite me, and the guy who had that desk was sitting there, and I was up at the other end of the office getting something out of a file cabinet or something, and a rocket hit a vacant building next to us, and the shrapnel came in through the wall, and the guy who was sitting at the desk opposite my desk was tough. He was basically cut in half. And he had about, this was, like I say, mid-February, he had about 4 weeks before he went home. His name was Rick Ramsey, he's from California. And it was just, it was just totally out of the, it was just totally out of the blue. It was really, and I think from that, even more so than what was going on at TED 2 or 3 weeks earlier, I think more than anything else that, it struck me that war is hell. And then we had another kid who had only been in the country maybe 3-4 weeks, and I don't think it was the same day, I think it was a day or two afterwards. He was in a barracks area that was hit one of these random things, and he was pretty badly hurt, and they thought he was going to make it, and I guess he had really bad liver damage, and he died. So there were 2 guys from our office. I mean, we were, sort of, not directly combatants, even though we were exposed to combat, as everybody was, because, I mean, it was a type of place which I'm sure you've probably been told, there were no front lines per se. Everybody was, everybody, to one degree or another, was exposed to, to a combat situation. And, losing 2 guys that, in your office is tough. But, everybody just sort of moved on when it was all over. And, but the wall behind where I would have been sitting was, there was shrapnel went into that wall. And there was one of these Filipino, what do they call them, monkey wood goblets or whatever, and that was shattered. So, I mean, I know that if I was sitting there, I wouldn't be sitting here. So you're sort of, obviously thankful for that. But it was a tough time for everybody. And that probably, that was, other than a few minor, guys getting some minor scratches here and there, that was the major incident in terms of anybody being killed or severely hurt. And it was sort of after that, shortly after that, where they sort of, for whatever reason, like I say, they sort of changed the focus of what we did, even though this didn't happen out in the field. Nothing that came close to that ever happened to anybody out in the field. I mean, so it's sort of ironic that here you are in the supposedly safe office, and bingo. Which I guess points up, what I said before, there were no front lines, and everybody was exposed to it in one way or another, to some degree or another. I mean, it's in a way, Iraq and Vietnam are very much different in the way they're alike, in the sense that you have a population that's wearing civilian clothes, and when you walk past them, you don't know what they're doing or thinking in their mind. And that's the way it was there. If you went into Saigon, you're walking down the street and you don't know if some terrorist is going to throw a hand grenade in the store that you happen to be buying a shirt at or something like that. But you learn a lot about yourself, and I know I did. And that's one of the reasons. I learned a lot about what was going on there, and learned a lot about myself, and different people, and so that's why I say I'm glad I went. And let's see, I went to Singapore. August. Well, before that they sent me to Da Nang, which was up the coast, for a month, because they were apparently short-handed up there, so they sent me up there for a month. And, I sort of enjoyed that, except they screwed up my pay for the month, so I had no money. But that finally got straightened out. And then it came back. Dave Lardy and I went to Singapore. Probably got back from Singapore sort of late August, and came home mid-September. I think I left the 12th, 13th, whatever.
What was it like to come home?
Well, the flight, I remember the flight, again, it was one of these charter airline type things, and as soon as the wheels came up off the ground in Saigon, big cheer went up. And we flew to, let's see, we went from Tanzania to Guam to Hawaii to San Francisco. And I was being discharged. Well, let me backtrack a minute. I still had, let's see, about 7 months to go on my enlistment. And after leaving Vietnam, and I already had orders to Eglin Air Force Base in Pensacola, Florida. So I figured, well, I'm going to Eglin for 6 or 7 months. And then they said, well, if you are going home with fewer than 9 months to go in your enlistment, and you're not going to re-enlist, you're out. I said, oh, okay. So I knew I was being discharged as soon as I hit California. And so we hit California. It was like early evening, and all of the base offices were closed, like personnel, finance, the places you had to process through to get out. And a guy I had been stationed with in Massachusetts, this was at Travis Air Force Base in California, just maybe 20 miles from San Francisco. And a guy I had been stationed with in Massachusetts was stationed at Travis. He was an older guy and he was married and had kids, so I remember I looked him up and he said, well, you know, we went to his house for dinner, and next morning I processed out, and they had a bus going to the San Francisco airport, and they gave you an airplane ticket, so you had a flight, and the bus was going to the San Francisco airport, and there was, I don't know, for whatever reason there was a taxi cab there, and I said, how much to San Francisco to the airport? And I had a bunch of money because I had cashed in some unused leave time and all that sort of thing. He says, $20. I said, you're on. So got to the airport, and the flight was the United Airlines Royal Hawaiian flight from Honolulu to San Francisco to New York. And it was like party central when I got on there. I remember that. I was in uniform and got home. Of course, my parents met me. Glad to see me and all that sort of thing. There it was.
What did you do next?
I started working in, I picked up, I had participated in that car thing I told you about before, about putting money aside. And when they said in Vietnam that, you know, you could get discharged, and so I started writing newspapers in upstate New York, and wound up working in Schenectady. So I mean, I was home in New York for a week or so, and picked up my car and went to Schenectady and started work.
You knew you wanted to be in upstate New York?
You know, it's funny because my master plan was going to Eglin Air Force Base to finish up that 6 or 7 months, and then I was going to go to the West Coast. So I never made it. I knew I didn't want to work in New York City, at least at that point. And I had friends who I'd gone to college with who were working in Schenectady. They were teachers. Well, one guy worked for GE, and his wife was a teacher and a librarian. And they were good friends from school. And I figured, well, you know, I'd rather go to some place where at least I knew some people. And so I wound up there.
How did you end up in the Twin Tiers?
Well, the newspaper I was working for, I started working there in October of '68, and they were bought out by the papers, eventually the paper in Albany, and I was making very little money at the time, and they offered me even less to stay. And the editor there knew the editor of the Star Gazette and said, "Hey, I got this guy, he's a good reporter, sports reporter. You got an opening," and it turns out they did. And it all turned out very well because I met my wife. She was working at the newspaper in Schenectady when I got there. So, you know, that worked out. And
was that in that paper as well?
In Schenectady? No.
Okay, but you did sports?
Yeah.
Okay.
From October to like April of '69, and then started here in June of '69.
And how long did you work here?
I worked till the end of '88, and then went to work for the county. So I've been there since January 1 of '89.
Mm-hmm. And you work in the VA for the county?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you do there?
Helping veterans with their claims for compensation, disability, stuff like that, education, you know, GI Bill claims and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Never thought I would do it, but I'm doing it.
Why did you decide to get into it?
Well, I started with the county in public information and did that for 6 years, and then there was a change of administration, and then the Veterans Office was having a little bit of a problem, and they said, "Would you like to go over there and help straighten things out a little bit?" And I said, "Okay." And I got into it, and you know, I like it, I really do. It's kind of a job where you can get burned out in a hurry, but so far, I mean, there are times I feel, you know, I don't really want to do this next week, but, you know, it's been good, for the most part.
Did you join any of the veterans organizations after your
The
service?
only organization I've joined is the American Legion, and that's because I have to be, in the job I'm doing, I have to be accredited by one of the service organizations like the American Legion or VFW. To be perfectly honest with you, if I didn't have to, I probably wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a joiner.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to demean any segment of veterans, but a lot of them, even though I work in the field, I'm not a professional veteran,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean. I don't parade around in camouflage outfits with badges all over my hat, and that's it's not me. I'm not demeaning anybody who does, but it's not me, and you know, I don't want to be something I'm not. So I have not joined, other than the American Legion, because I have to, but I don't go to any meetings or any stuff like that.
To backtrack,
Yeah.
the job you took in Schenectady, did you go after a sports job? Did
Yeah.
you want something lighter at
Yeah.
that point?
Oh, I always, like in high school and college, you know, I worked in the high school newspaper, and then in college, I didn't work on the college paper, but I worked in the sports publicity office.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, that's what I was looking at. I didn't go into sports in Schenectady specifically because I needed something lighter than what I had been doing. It's just that's what I wanted to eventually do anyway.
How did your skills have to change?
Skills have to change. That's a good question. I think I had to develop. Well, I had to develop people skills of a different vein than the people skills that I had. You know, you had a military mentality, and you were very often dealing with people who outranked you by several grades. So you had to be kind of, in some cases, careful. You certainly had to be diplomatic. You certainly had to be respectful of their rank and the fact that a lot of these people have been in service for a long time, and this is not their first war. that sort of thing. They really, they really laid it on the line, so to speak. And then here you are dealing with, 17-year-old high school basketball players who, their major concern is, are they going to have a good game Friday night and they're going to have a date Saturday night, that sort of thing. So you had to develop a certain, a different set of skills, even though on the one hand you had people skills, and on the other hand you also had people skills, but a different approach to them, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I guess too, also, I think I realized that, okay, I'm out there looking at a football game or a basketball, but it's a game, Mm-hmm. I've seen nasty things happen. This is a game, and no matter what the coach tells you after the game, hey, it's not the end of the world, that sort of thing. Not take it as seriously as maybe some people might. So I think that's probably the biggest from a work standpoint. From outside of work, I ran into people that I was friends with that had totally different viewpoints than I did about Vietnam. And I should say that, okay, I got home in September of '68, so that's 35 years ago, and my attitudes have changed over 35 years. There's no question about that. But at that time, I was probably a little more set in the way I felt, which was, opposite to a large degree to the way a lot of other people felt that I knew. And it's not that you have, and most of them were they didn't bring it up, so there were no, knockdown, drag-out arguments or anything like that. But I can remember a few discussions, shall we say, mm-hmm. with some people.
What were the two perspectives?
Well, that the country made a major mistake of doing or the leadership of this country made a major mistake in doing what they did, and I probably at that time took a totally opposite view. Today I think my view is what we set out to do was, for lack of a better word, noble, but the way it evolved and how things were managed and how things were run was actually what led to many of the troubles and problems over there. Mm-hmm. So I think my view has evolved. I still think, as I say, what we tried to do was noble, but the
What were the two perspectives?
Well, that the country made a major mistake of doing or the leadership of this country made a major mistake in doing what they did, and I probably at that time took a totally opposite view. Today I think my view is what we set out to do was, for lack of a better word, noble, but the way it evolved and how things were managed and how things were run was actually what led to many of the troubles and problems over there. Mm-hmm. So I think my view has evolved. I still think, as I say, what we tried to do was noble, but the way we went about it, not the individual guy on the ground, but the people sitting in Washington, for example. The way that evolved, I think, was disastrous and led to led to what happened.
Since you got out of the military, have you tried to learn more about Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because for the first few years, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to read about it, and that sort of thing. And I would say over the last, probably the last 10 years, I've read a lot. I just, as I say, I just finished a really good book, which was an interesting take, or an interesting approach. It's written by David Marinas of the Washington Post, and what he did is he took a point in time, October of 1967. Just coincidentally, I was there, and he took the actions involving a particular Army company, and at the same time, there were student protests going on at the University of Wisconsin, and he just did it, kind of a double track of here's what's happening in Vietnam, here's what's happening in Wisconsin. And I saw him on television on C-SPAN with one of the student leaders of the protest, who later turned out to be like a 6-term mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, and the guy who commanded that company. And the guy who commanded the company was very, very bitter over what happened. A lot of his men got killed and ambushed. It could have been avoided, but he's very bitter about the leadership at the very top and what happened. Well, anyway, the author, Marinas, the colonel, or the captain who later retired out of the Army as a colonel, the daughter of the guy the book is called They Marched into Sunlight, David Marinas, the author, and he and the captain of this, or actually he was a lieutenant at the time, of this infantry company, who retired as a colonel, and the daughter of the battalion commander who was killed during the engagement went back to Vietnam. They actually found the commander of the Viet Cong unit that had pulled off the ambush, and they went to the site. And it was C-SPAN actually followed them to Vietnam, and it was very interesting. And as I say, it was a 2-track book. Here's the protests in this country, and here's what's going on in Vietnam, and there were a couple of points where they actually intersected. But this, getting back to what you said about reading stuff, this is a book probably 15, 20 years ago. If it had been written, I wouldn't have touched it. But as I say, I've read that. I've read some other stuff, and there's a lot of good books out there that really get into what happened and why. This particular book I really enjoy. In fact, I found the author's home address and wrote him a 3-page letter, and got an email back from him. It was interesting. But yeah, I probably in the last 5 or 8 years I've started to try and read more, both from a military standpoint and political standpoint.
Do you think that the historians are doing a good job of going back and sorting it all out?
I think they're starting to.
Okay.
I think they're starting to. I think they're paying more, or putting more focus on not what went wrong, because that's been documented, but why it went wrong. And I don't want to use the word blame, but obviously there were people who made decisions. There were people who had certain methods of running the war that, of course, hindsight is wonderful, but there was a lot of, and I think it's indisputable that there was a lot of micromanagement going on by Lyndon Johnson and McNamara and people like that. And I think historians are doing a good job of documenting that as much as it can be.
Now, do you still write?
Yeah, I do actually. I do a little freelance now and then. And
for newspapers?
I've done some for the Star Gazette, and I've got a project going with a magazine called Life in the Finger Lakes. They only publish 4 times a year, so I'm sort of off in the future, but hopefully that can come around, and I'm going to retire in about 2 years. So hopefully after the 2 years, when that's over, I can do some more. So I enjoy doing it.
Did your family keep the letters that you sent home?
I don't think so.
Okay. So you never got to go back and read them?
No, my parents are both deceased now, and I don't recall them ever mentioning that they kept them, and I know I didn't keep theirs, but yeah, I don't think they did. They may have, but they moved shortly after I got home, and if they did have them, they didn't survive the move. But I never even thought about it, quite frankly.
What about the photographs? You mentioned you still have some of the news photographs. Did you take your personal photos while you were over there as well?
I have some, yeah, and I have some, stuff that I took. As I said, we had photographers assigned to us, so guys were always, fooling around in the office. In fact, there's one shot. It was posed naturally, obviously. I've got a .38 in my hand, and I had just taken a puff of a cigarette. It looks like the smoke's coming out of the weapon, that sort of thing. And I didn't take. I don't think I took a ton of pictures myself. Because if you saw something you liked, you could usually find out who the photographer who did it, somewhere, and I'm not sure where they are at home. I've got a whole, not a tray, but a whole stack of 35mm slides of various night combat over Saigon. I don't even know why I had it, but probably somebody said, hey, I made an extra set, we wanted that sort of thing.
How often do you go back and look at these?
Every once in a while. Every once in a while. There's an association of guys who were stationed at Tonsanut that you're talking about joining things. I did join that only because Bob Need, the master sergeant in our office, he's involved in it, and he and I reconnected a couple of years ago after we hadn't seen each other in 33 years, and he's 73 years old. That's hard to believe. Anyway. And he does a newsletter once a month, and we had a reunion a couple of years ago, and I took a lot of that stuff down. And, it was kind of good. There was a lot of people I didn't know because who were there, and there weren't that many people there, unfortunately. But we all shared some experiences, at least, or common experiences. But I probably don't have a lot of pictures.
Do you have them stored in photo albums or just?
No, they're actually in a big, manila envelope.
Okay. Is there anything that you still want to say that we haven't touched on?
Well, you've done a good job. You really have.
Did you keep a diary while you were
No,
there?
didn't keep a diary. You don't think of these things, that when you're there. I guess, even though, okay, I don't see how to put this. Even though probably I've only touched base with, maybe 2, at the most 3 guys I worked with over the years, and in touching base with 2 of the 3, it's only been through emails. Only one of them has been actually getting together for live in person. They were all a super bunch of people, and we had a couple of jerks, but over the course of a year. But by and large, they were just great people. that's the way I'd like to remember them. I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much for doing this.